Hello? Okay, so after this absolutely fascinating presentation, although long, it's been fantastic. We will invite you for a second time, but we'll give you more time. Anyway, more time next time, because we all want to know more, for sure. So let's start this second and last round panel of the symposium, and I would like to introduce Mireia Saladrigas, although many of you already know her. As you know, the model is slightly different to yesterday. We now start the debate. We will talk for a short while, and at 10 to 6, Mireia will go and get ready, and then while we close the conclusions, she will get ready, and her performance will start at 6. So, you already know her, but I will introduce her. She's an artist and researcher, or rather, both things at the same time. And this expresses, or that's what I interpret, a bi-directional relationship. Her projects are built on wide research, but also research methodologies that she employs in each occasion are settled on the artistic base and foundation. She's currently a PhD in the Fine Arts Department of the Helsinki University, and her PhD project called Behaviors that are non-conventional in exhibition context. She talks about human alteration and non-human alteration in cultural practices, and proposes an artistical and theoretical rereading of inconformity. There's many more things I could say about her, but I would like to stress and highlight that there's a project of hers that can be seen and visited in Barcelona, if I'm not mistaken, in the Fabra and Coach Art Center in San Andreu, where a few days ago, Polvere Gira, it was installed, so impalpable dust clouds that are related to a wider research project she will be talking more about during her performance. So I won't go in deeper into that. So, going back to what I said yesterday, I am very interested and fascinated by the fact that we have two researchers here and an artist that is also performing research, and we're going back to the archive with multiple perspectives. They're always different. We find different ways of starting to work on the archive. So, just hang on for a second. I would like to start by just to talk about José Luis and his presentation. I will take a quote by Ramon Albert this morning, and he said that we need to make documents speak depending on the questions as motivate each research. José Luis, your research is a clear example. I wouldn't have seen 50% of the documents if it hadn't been for you looking at them or trying to find them specifically in your presentation. And at the same time, there's more things I would like to talk about your presentation, but before I do that, I would like to make a general comment to the three of you, and I have it here somewhere. Just hang on, let me find it. It is a bit long and complicated to explain, but there is something I am interested in, generally speaking, when we talk about the institution, and this is something I have written about when working with artists. I am interested and fascinated by the fictional character any institution has. Institutions, generally speaking, are human conventions. People decide that something is a church or a museum or a parliament, and that is a sort of collective fiction we all believe in, and that makes us or makes the system work. And I like the fact that Ernst spoke about this afternoon about fiction in archive and what are the fictional aspects, or what could be one of the ways of relating fiction to archives. You gave examples of, more specifically, the Valley Rabat case, but it uses information that is truthful information to use ensembles that are not real, but they do provide real information. And there's real with fictional assemblies and mountings and installations. In the case of José Luis, you have used pictorial definition, so they are not fragments of reality. These documents are fictitious in some sense, but then at the same time, you can use them as a foundation to create a series of conclusions on the value of the document at a specific historical moment. So I would like, and Mireia is very clear, she works on data and research, absolutely scientific in character, and nature to lead on to her performance. So I would like for each one of you to elaborate on, if you can, maybe this idea of what is this relationship that many times is bidirectional between fiction and the character or nature of the archive, fictional character of the archive, and is based on real data, but what it ends up building is fiction, basically, upon which we then work. Maybe, José Luis, you want to start? Well, I don't really want to start after having spoken for so long, but anyway, now I promise I'll be short in my answer. And I'm also looking at Pilar like a naughty boy that did naughty things. But jokes aside, I think that it is very interesting what you're saying here, Mela, because it is true that when I started this work, and I'm not going to go into that now, why I started doing this work, but I did realize that we could find several perspectives on the archive document. On the one hand, we can find the perspective of the author. So why is the author wanting to introduce a document right there? In some occasion, it is very clear, just to leave proof that he is responsible or she is responsible. But in some other occasions, this is more linked to the person in the portrait or the scene in the painting. And we have a second perspective there, which is the image of the person that is in the portrait. It may be that the author wants to include a document to stress or highlight something about that person in the portrait. They are building a fiction or maybe helping that person to build and construct their fiction. And then on the other hand, we have the spectators, the audience. The audience that sees the painting and interprets the painting based on the context of that epoch, and the current audience, ourselves, when we look at the paintings and interpret them in a specific way. So I see four different perspectives here: the author, the person in the portrait, the context, the spectators of that time, and the spectators of this time, of present times. And everyone creates their own fiction. We see the document with a different perspective. Some include intentionality, and some others interpret it with interpretive perspective, a different perspective. I think it is basically the combination of all those points of view what helps to form that fictional character and nature you were talking about. And that's when I shut up. Ernst?
You say first something about your phrase to make the document speak, because I think that's very interesting, because of this, it suggests that we as scholars or as artists have to do something in order to make the document speak. It does not speak for itself. And in art history, the discipline of art history, it is often presented as if artworks present us with all kinds of interpretive problems. And in order to solve these interpretive problems, we have to go to the context, and information about the context can be found in the archive. So, and then the archive is seen as a collection of facts. We do not have to interpret. And I think that's a complete misunderstanding. Often you have to go to the context and in the archive, but there you find other interpretive problems. And, but then, I talked a lot about fiction, especially in the context of Walid Raad. And in his case, his archive is literally a fiction, because it does not really exist, and also he invented all these characters who donated all kinds of material to the archive. And these persons do not exist. It's a real fiction. But you can radicalize, in a way, what he says about his archive as a kind of fiction. Erik Ketelaar, in his talk, he made a distinction between a kind of organic notion of the archive and a more constructivist notion of the archive. An archive that grows naturally, and all these facts, they grow together and they are there in the archive. Or no, it is a construction, and we as human beings, we as human agents, are responsible for the construction of an archive. And when you when you see the archive as a construction, and I think most of us do that, and we acknowledge our agency as archivists or people dealing with the archive, that kind of agency, then you can also say that every archive has a kind of fictional element, in the sense that they are all constructed. It is not just a collection of facts, no.
Sí, eso es exactamente.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was talking about. The fact that when artists certify their authorship with a little paper and not just writing their names, they might be doing this because the fact that it's written on a paper confers more truth and authenticity to that statement and declaration. This is just a fictional construction, basically, and you imagine something, and the other person looking at the painting will imagine the same thing, and this projects a very good light on archives that are non-fictional archives, because it makes you wonder to what extent everything is not constructed. I agree with something Ern said about context. Context in archives is essential. That is the key to all and everything, and that is when they stop being fiction and become a reality. There's an article, I can't remember the author now, but the context is everything, and it's true. I'm bringing it to my field by the metadata schemes and plans that are being developed currently and that are being implemented. Want to explain the context of the creation of the documents. In order to be able to understand a document, we need to know the context of creation. I believe that we have seen magnificent examples here. Yesterday, Sylvia and Nuria were presenting them, this morning Pilar as well. These are studies based on context, on knowing the person, on knowing the way these people worked. That is the context of document creation, and it is essential. In these conceptual models, we have speak a lot in these relationships in order to facilitate access to information. But I believe, yes, I totally agree with you, is essential. Context is essential. Mireia?
Human agency, I think it's completely normal that writers, but also artists, sign their work. There's an author responsible for the work. And in recent years, now what is it, the last 10 or 20 years, you see it also in museums, that curators who have curated an exhibition, in the introduction of the exhibition, the name of the curator responsible for the exhibition is mentioned. And I think that should also now be done with archives. The archivist responsible for the archive should be mentioned, and it's not somebody who is in the background. Because this human agency responsible for this whole, the order of the archive is not a neutral guardian. No, it's a human agent and with a lot of power.
Sí, bueno, yo no puedo más.
Indeed, I cannot more than agree with you, because actually in my experience as archive manager, one of the proposals that we tried to push forward, and well, actually we couldn't, was to ensure that taxonomies were signed, as dictionaries are signed. No one really knows except for Maria Moliner who are the authors of dictionaries, right? But all dictionaries have authors. Definitions are not like fruits from a tree. So let's hand it over to Mireia. Yeah, words are generated by photosynthesis, one would say. Now, well, I have to thank José Luis for your presentation. You'll be the only one to thank me, believe me. It's been awful. No, but as you displayed all the pictures, we made a parallel with other paintings, the Pantocrator here in the Manac and many others. And one of the points about your presentation that I really appreciated. You referred to fiction, and all of a sudden a painting came to my mind while combining your presentation with your question, the prime time of Botticelli. Botticelli's prime time. Botticelli painted 500 vegetable species, amongst which more than 300 flowers from the Toscan. And they all exist. So he did an archiving exercise. He recollected, he gathered botanical information, and actually what one could even speak about a document which is not necessarily a collection of dry flowers, which in fact were rare back then, and the Medici were amongst the few who were performing taxonomic activities, but he was concerned about painting with all detail and realism. The majority of these flowers, very, very few, are fictional, only those coming out of somebody's mouth or stamped in a dress, but the rest are veridic. So not painting the document with a little leaf or a little book. No, the painting becomes a book, a catalog, and this is fictional, and at the same time it's full of truth, of veracity. So it's very communicative as a piece of art. So perhaps Botticelli had this revelation. All of a sudden he developed this concern for a certain piece of knowledge, and he said, okay, well, I don't know why, I mean where his curiosity stemmed from, but definitely he had this botanic curiosity. And again, you said that sometimes archivists go from the most fictional element to the most extreme detailed truth. I decided to dig into an iconoclastics case, and my first aim was to gather all the documents stemming from the hammer that smashed Michelangelo's work in the 91, and I wanted to see what had happened, or what happens when such a gesture takes place, right? Because from an art history perspective, there is a lack of detail. There is, of course, a narrative, right? Like, oh, a crazy person showed up and hammered Michelangelo's work, but actually, there's no such thing as a critical approach on the event. So again, I had some trouble in accessing the documents such as the archive of the Superior Court of Florence. It's been difficult. Well, it's always difficult to access an archive, right? And all of a sudden I had like a vision. I told myself, wow, this is a dust cloud, Fabra y Coats, and this dust cloud, I don't really know why this came to my mind. Perhaps because I was having trouble accessing the document, but I had the vision at the moment when the fingers fall apart, or fall down rather, very tiny fragments like a nail, and all of a sudden they fall down and there's dust. How tiny is dust? How tiny can a fragment or a part be, and to what extent can you smash a sculpture or a stone, and what would happen if we really zoomed into this moment and all of a sudden we realize that there's dust that is invisible and yet is all around, these micro particles of dust that are there floating in the ambient. And there's something with dust that is, I mean, dust is there all the time, and it really obsesses me. Dust is very literal as an object, and it brings a lot of information. Geologists actually make the most of the traveling dust, or the dust that travels around different continents. And I'm also interested in the idea of destruction and recirculation. It's the tiniest matter that is not so much destroyed, but rather well, it piles up, right? It accumulates. So I was trying to make the link between archives and dust Well, I mean, there's dust in archives, so there's a direct connection. Well, I'm trying to perhaps reflect on this, right? This author speaks about Derrida and ends up speaking about dust. So I'm not the first one. I don't know about you, but I see some fascinating parallels here between the girl's book, the one that shows the plants, pictures, the MoMA images with plants, and your work. So that's why I ask you whether you're sure or not on whether you're an artist. You are. Interrogating a document that documents what one is not looking for. What you decide to look for is something different, which has a secondary role, or perhaps it's not in the center, in the core of the image. Or as you said, what happens when you zoom in so much that you lose track of the general image and you focus on a detail? Well, probably you end up extracting other interesting information. I have a long list of questions, but perhaps there's someone in the audience that have questions. It's your last opportunity. ¿Me coges un segundo?
Pues una pregunta muy rápida.
Very quick question. I have to ask José Luis. We can hardly see now. Yes, now we can. Okay, I liked the presentations of all of you, but I do have a question for your work, fascinating work, José Luis. And regardless of the duration, it was fascinating. So I remembered a work I did on MoMA and how the photographic archive at a certain point, it reaches the conclusion that photographic indexation is the textual one. So each photography had textual indexation, so it identified something that was predominant in the first plane. And the story of the MoMA exhibitions were too heavily based on what the text stated as an image reference. So MoMA proposed, because they have a lot of money, to generate a new version of the history of art of their own exhibitions with a software of the indexation of other works of art that would appear in miniature, tiny-sized, and with artificial intelligence, this was done in like 2 days, what you would take, I don't know, a whole life to do. So anyway, all this introduction to just ask you, how have you indexed the new versions of the paintings now that you have this document more present? The new versions in what sense, Katarina? What do you mean? Don't you want to generate a new history of art based on, isn't that what you said? Well, if I must say, thank you, Katarina. I'm very thankful for your question. I'm not too sure, though. Anyway, if I want to say, well, the origin of this work was a visit, touristic visit to the National Gallery. I suddenly saw the image of a document in one of the works and I took a picture. Then I continued my itinerary and made another picture and another one. And then in the end, I realized that I'd done hundreds of photos of images of documents that was just left there for a few years. And in 2020, at the end of 2020, the Association of University Archivists in Mexico invited me to participate virtually in their annual congress to do the closing session. And the person who got in touch with me told me that I had absolute freedom on the topics, so I proposed 2 topics. The first one was metadata plans, or a topic that I'm thinking about, which is the image of documents in art. And he said, oh my God, we're saturated and overwhelmed with technical issues, so humanistic would be better. So I opted for this work where I studied the image of document in the 19th century paintings in Museu del Prado. And answering your question, Caterina, when I did this work, I must point out that it took me quite a long time because the identification of the different categories and taxonomies proved to be complex. Identifying the functional contexts in which documents were used, trying to define those categories I presented before was somewhat complex back then. So I even had to recompose the taxonomy relationship and review the works because that indexation at first was complicated.
In this case, it's been much easier because I had a previous experience, right? So the indexation or the definition of categories and subcategories, especially functional ones, has been much simpler, the indexation. Nonetheless, this will stay here, and of course Silvia, the Picasso Museum, will publish the document with pleasure. Is there any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I'll jump in. I have one very specific question. While listening to your presentation, Mireia was telling me how interesting all these centuries with more or less archives. Is this related to the existence of the print? The prints? This is not a threat, even if it sounds like one. I must say that systematically I gathered images coming from documents exclusively, but also systematically, and considering that the review process was sequential in my natural non-artificial intelligence, I selected works where books appear, thinking about the appearance of the print. So the figure is larger, more than 500 works. Of course, there's a reality, right? And this has to do with a fictional element, which is an anachronism in some cases. Some of the representations that we have seen and some of the ones that we haven't seen are anachronic. I didn't display an image with Saint Paul writing the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, a work painted back in the 16th century and super anachronic. Saint Paul didn't write the letter with this style, right? I am sure about this now. I was tempted to bringing the image that, I mean, how would Saint Paul write the letter in the 21st century? I wanted to update it using artificial intelligence. So yeah, interesting. And I wanted to replace the document with a laptop because I'm sure the letter would be written in a laptop. In the 15th and in the 16th century, the representation of documents are absolutely anachronic. They are fictional. Later, perhaps during costumerism, portraits, paintings are synchronic with the times. Paintings are more faithful with the times. I really enjoyed Mireia's remark when she said that Botticelli's Springtime is faithful because it combines both approaches. On the one hand side, I mean, some documents are extremely faithful to what they aim at representing, and on the other hand, there's fiction. Sometimes the author imagines things as being isolated as they were back in the 16th century, or as how we believe they were in the 16th century, and they aim at representing, I don't know, the 1st century. Enric Farrés is in the room. I had the pleasure of sharing a project with him in which, well, now that you refer to books, Enric once suggested in the framework of a project in Reina Sofia Library to switch books from one library to another and to reverse the books, right? To put the books in an opposite position. And we invited the director of the library, the Escorial Director Library, or Escorial Library Director rather, to give a presentation about different approaches to position books in the shelves. And the presentation was illustrated with classical paintings, and it's available online. It's amazing.
One last comment from my side. What I would like to do is to make a comparison between your project, and I think an extremely interesting and important project, and some of the artist archival projects I have discussed. Because what you were doing, looking for the representation of documents in this painting, I think that's completely a legitimized kind of project. Also interesting, a visual painting with a document, which is something else, and what do these artists do? So it's completely, in a way, and I wouldn't say conventional, but legitimate. Whereas what many of these artists do, for instance, Inge Meijer, and when she starts to look for plans in the photographs of exhibitions, it's a little bit bizarre. It's completely unconventional. So I think that's an artist redoing your kind of research would not look for the representation of documents, but for instance, what kind of tails do animals and paintings have? Do they have curled tails or do they have straight tails? And how do we then suddenly look differently to these paintings? That provides a completely new kind, unexpected kind of knowledge.
Sí, aunque yo debo decir que en este caso, volviendo a la idea del...
Yeah, but going back to the idea of context, I mean, in this context, the research, José Luis' research makes sense, but if we switch context, perhaps it would lose sense. The context is everything. Actually, we can understand the meaning of this exhibition when, I don't know, if in 100 years the archives of the Menac and the Picasso Museum hold the archives of this symposium, well, they will only be understood in today's context. The context matters. Of course, if you, I don't know, if this was an art history conference, they would be thinking, who the hell is him? I'm afraid... Oh, there's another question. I was about to interrupt the session.
Just specifically directed to José Luis. Why were these documents painted? I have done research for the Dutch portraiture in the 17th century, and they developed in the 17th century a totally new genre, being a group portrait of a group of governors of a hospital or some other institution, and you showed one of them, by the way. And I found out that in some cases we can even identify the document on the table, which is still preserved in the archives of that institution. And to make a long story short...
No. Please?
Para los agentes querían...
Literally, an image of being a professionals and doing this for the common good. And therefore, they showed all these documents saying the real accountability is in the documents. And trust us because we are competent record keepers. So therefore, there we exactly know why they portrayed these documents.
Please,
but we also know that the public, and that was maybe a bit missing in the presentation, what the public was thinking about these portraits. We know that from in the Dutch context, but have you any idea how, apart from the religious painting, because that's clear, but in the other genres, did the public catch the meaning as portrayed on the pictures? Have you any data on that?
No tengo... disculpe. Gracias.
So, thank you, Professor, for the question. I don't have any further data. I must say and acknowledge that the information I have shared with you corresponds to the first category, pictorial genres. In principle, my idea would be to publish a more extended document with the rest of categories, with information about the rest of categories, the functions by which documents are introduced in the work and the importance of the document in the work this afternoon. I've only shared information about pictorial genres, and I have information about other elements that I will work on in a further research. I must say there was an error, and the problem is that I read the instructions like I read that the maximum extension was 15,000 words, so I kept writing and writing and writing, and then I went back to the instructions, and then I realized that the maximum extension was 15,000 characters, not words, and I counted the characters, and I was like, wow, I'm way past it. I had already 30,000 characters, so I had to cut it short and present only these first category genres. And of course, I understand it's difficult to understand the context in which these documents are inserted into the works, right? And even more difficult it would be to understanding the perception of those who visited the audience, right, of these works back then.
The portrait by Marinus van Rijmerswale, who was a Dutch painter, of these two tax collectors, or rather it is a tax collector and the contraroleur, the controller. We know that in the office, so in the 15th century, in the office of the Receiver General of the district, was hanging a version of this particular portrait. So imagine you have the man who is responsible for the finances of the district. He buys a portrait or a painting showing these two tax collectors. So there you have a sliver of why people were so interested in these paintings.
Sí, sí, sí.
Bien, yo siento muchísimo
I am really sorry to interrupt this fascinating debate. We have to let Mireia get ready. Thank you very much for your participation to this panel. And I'm going to hand it over to the organizers for the reading of the conclusions.